All right, welcome back, everybody. We're hoping that that was really rich dialogue, generative. Perhaps you walked away with some ideas of what you want to do next. Just a couple of observations from, I was in 2 out of the 3 groups, and it was really helpful for me to be in smaller groups and hear from everybody, different perspectives. And a couple of things that came out of the groups that I was in that I just noted were some of the things that were missing in the history. Joe, you were always so present as a leader in bringing through the thread around cultural congruence and the fact that the history really didn't center on cultural relevance and historic factors in communities. And that led to a really interesting dialogue about the tensions politically in a climate that Texas is in, with the tension of being a part of a peer movement that is really rooted in a social justice movement, and how you navigate that in your state to ensure that the movement continues, and how does that show up in your state while also working through some of the limitations and the political climate that you have. So that was an interesting thing. Another one for me that came up was the notable history of, I believe it was called the Via Hope Prop program. And some of you maybe were a part of the prop program that took place for over a decade to support peer-run organizations and learning some different tools, techniques, and skills around organizational development and operation. And then the third one that was really interesting was Legislative Day, and how historically there was a Legislative Day, and even separate from that, peer organizations would get together at the legislature, have different booths, and legislators were able to go around and learn about peer-run organizations and the impact that they're having in their local community. So those were just 3 things that struck me as I was walking through. I also heard a lot of kudos, and a lot of the history was really helpful and feels really relevant today. So that was also good to be able to hear. And so we just want to hear from you all. What were the themes? What were the things that you feel like either ideas that were generated that you want to move forward with, or things that you didn't know were existing in Texas, or just things that you want to be able to talk through for the last 40 minutes or so that we have? What felt notable in your groups?
Well, I'll start with just right quick because I think that last group was the future, right? And I think from the first group, you already said it, Shireen, exactly. I mean, you described it great, exactly what came out of that as far as the cultural piece, right? And for me, it's a training that has to happen. And because I think when we talk about multiple paths of recovery, you can't talk about that without really knowing the cultures of these paths, right? Is there a Latino path? Is there a Native American, the Red Road of Recovery path, right? Is there LGBT path? How do I learn about that so I can serve my community? The other thing that came up for me, the second group was also second one was also with Via Hope and MHA and NAMI, of course, and I was part of the mental health before the peer stuff that I worked on, and we went back. Me and Janet Palaio was in my group with us, and we went back to Dan Fisher, Dr. Joel Feiner, and this was in the early '90s, before '98 with the peer, because I worked with Dr. Feiner, Mental Health Connections. I started the first African American NAMI. So the mental health value, both of these, what do we value today, right? And how does our history bring that value forward, right? And even into the future. So with the cultural piece, to me, that's huge. That there needs to be training, education, there needs to be learning and some unlearning. There's a lot of biases that's still within this group right here, right? And how do we either unlearn, get rid of that so we can learn how do we really serve and support different cultures, including in my last one, because I had those 3 in our last group as far as the future, was people with disabilities, right? And because I'm on the Texas Certification Board for VR services, that's vocational rehabilitation, right? So people with, and mental health and substance use are on there. And that's the reason why I did join and get into spread recovery. They didn't know what peer support was on the workforce, right? And now they do, right? And they've actually put out, a grant and all of that. But the thing is that those 3, as far as the future and the values that I hold, as far as people of color, as far as communities of different, you know what I mean, cultures, you know what I mean, and how do we learn about those cultures? Because it's not in our training. We still have not got that yet, and we need to put that into practice as soon as possible. Those three.
Elaine, your hand is up.
Hi. I was part of actually Joe Paul's last group, and we were talking about the training, cultural training, but also we were talking about training for the many pathways of recovery. And Ben, you left. I'm sorry. I actually kind of wanted to address you a little bit too, because it was something you said, and then our time was just cut off. But I wanted to say, I brought up like, well, I know some people that use yoga for recovery. I don't know how you would train for that. But in that conversation, what I felt like I was starting to hear was us defining recovery. And I don't know that we necessarily want to do that, like the proven methods. And yeah, no, we don't want to alienate 12-steppers or anything, but I find the people that I work with, very few are 12-step aligned. So I don't know how you could, like, if they're chasing recovery, like I'm going to support them however they're doing it. If that means it doesn't look like recovered to other people, it's not for me to decide, right? I'm just helping them to reach their goals. So I just found that a little bit difficult to decide. Or to see how to train for the multiple pathways. And even the cultural piece, I think, would be a little hard to train for. And like we were talking about, I was saying earlier, people don't know I'm Black unless I tell them. But I'll tell you what, from the North to the South, it's still even a totally different thing. When you get into like, it gets, these different microcosms of it. So although we're not in the North right now, and I get that, but what is known there isn't known here. And so I find myself like having to feel my way around a lot of these sort of things that aren't universal to a culture. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Elaine. Other thoughts, either based on what Elaine and Joe said or something else that emerge in your groups?
Well, this is Ruth. Should I raise my hand?
Jump right in, Ruth.
All right, I'm going to jump in. I'm sorry, Jason. You go next. One of the things that I think we talked about a little bit in one of our groups is this idea also that it's about addressing something outside of the medical model, and the importance of peer work and the peer experience in both helping and becoming a peer, like that journey is so crucial for, as we said, recovery, whatever that looks like, whatever that is. And I think that the medical community is doing a really lousy job, quite honestly, of addressing mental health issues. And this is where the peer movement brings a whole other perspective to that needs to be promoted, advocated for, understood. And as we look to the future, I think, Joe, when you're talking about like what is it that we need to do, the education piece is a bit about that as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ruth. Jason.
One of the things I've been struck by over Friday's conversation and this conversation, it oftentimes when we talk about the movement, we're talking about it in the context of the roles, the peer role. And when I think about the recovery movement, I really think about it in broader terms. There's the various different types of services and organizations that have been developed. There's also the infrastructure, the advocacy, policy advocacy work that's done. And yes, there are the roles that have been developed through this movement. And oftentimes I think that the roles have been developed and shaped because of some outside forces like funding, integration, and all that's great, but that doesn't give us the full picture of what the movement has been, or perhaps where we should go forward. In one of the groups I had shared, it was, gosh, maybe 18 months ago that we lost Dylan West. And I remember being at his celebration ceremony going, oh my gosh, we are losing some of the giants, and how many of the giants that got us to where we are today have we forgotten? And it was about that time that I started looking for funding. Recovery People has a small grant to start capturing oral histories around the history of recovery in Texas. And we've got a docu-series that's going to start coming out next year. We're in post-production for the first season and going to start filming the next one in 2024. So definitely would love to interview many people, not all of you, on this call. And at the same time, we can't do this ourselves. It's too big of a project. So I really encourage all of us to start capturing the history, and all of us to be working on history projects. Thank you.
So I have a question based on what you just said, Jason, and based on the conversation about cultural congruence, and the medical system doesn't really understand or serve folks experiencing big emotions or emotional distress well, is how do we reconcile the fact that the movement came from an anti-oppression movement? And as you said, Jason, we focus so much on the roles, the workforce of peer support, but the whole history was really about political climate, about policy change. It was activism and disruption. And, I've heard this from so many people in so many states, that once it became a job, it no longer was a movement. And how do we hold both at the same time? Do we hold both at the same time? How do we do that when we're working for the very systems that our ancestors and our pioneers were fighting to change? Yeah, go ahead. It was a question that followed up with what you were saying, Jason. So please feel free to answer that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that we need to, the question's valid, and we should explore that. But this is something I brought up on Friday, and you restated it and didn't really capture what I was trying to communicate. While yes, I do believe that the recovery movement in part has been about social justice and making a big change, what I was trying to communicate on Friday is that much of the movement wasn't about trying to change policy. It was about just creating services and support for each other. And I see those as two things to be recognized and two different things to be captured.
Yeah, and you add on, there was an abolition part of the movement that wanted to abolish existing systems. There was a part of our movement that was about creating alternatives. There was, it was a pretty wide continuum of the history of this movement. Go ahead, Anna.
Well, and I really appreciated what Jason said, because I think it shows a bit of a difference in the movements that led to behavioral health, right? Because it was to get services for substance use, field for sure. And on the mental health side, in the 70s, it was almost abolitionist, right? It was like, we don't want any of your services. We want to be able to heal without being medicalized. And so I think the rich history of both of those movements, I think, is essential. And the one thing, though, that I think both of those have in common is, what does that mean for a workforce? Because when we take on the identity of employee, we run the risk of knowing that we still have to use our voice to speak up to get what helps us heal. And I think if we're not careful, that's where my concern comes in, is if we forget the civil rights, social justice piece, even on the SU side, the sense of this is not a character flaw. Stop treating me like I'm broken and it's all my fault, right? It's like, where does that voice come in when we're doing work, say, in a local mental health authority or in a treatment center? And if we lose that history, and the peer movement kind of broke off from the civil rights, I'm not going to say that they continue to be totally aligned, but my fear is if we just, without judging the struggle, if we're not acknowledging the struggle that brought us where we are, our future is going to look a lot like we are just another cog in a very big system. We're no longer different. We no longer bring a different voice. If we're not careful, that's my fear. If we don't remember the struggle that led to, wait a minute, we have a different voice. We have a voice that says we can have full and complete lives. We're not a diagnosis. We're not a label. You know, we're not the addict. We're not the mentally ill person or the mental patient. We are human beings who have the ability to become whatever we put our minds to, given an opportunity to have that hope. And so that's where I think it's so important for the future for us to recognize where we are today didn't just happen in a vacuum. And where we are today needs to be fought for in terms of our peerness, in terms of fidelity to what it is to have a recovery model. And that, I think, is an ongoing effort that I think is very, very important. And one thing that came up in that last group for us that I thought was really cool, that I would love to have more as a thread through our history, and that was volunteerism and the importance of volunteerism for claiming hope. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, Ben.
You know, it's always good to hear on, you know, I mean, she's when she talks about being rooted in a movement, a mental health movement that started back in the 70s, that was, you know, I know several people that come out of that, and you know, it was some of them describe themselves as survivors of the mental health care system, you know. And I get that, you know, because in a way, our organization and we are casualties in the war on drugs, for example, you know, and our movement grew up around principles that we learned in our own recovery. And part of that is mutual support, and part of it is, the point I really want to make is our movement is our recovery movement at the national level and state level, and here in El Paso at the local level, is we want to serve people in recovery from alcoholism and drug addiction. We want to make it as possible as it can be for someone to recover. We believe that recovery is possible, and we want to make sure that gets expressed in what we do in our recovery movement. You know, we have natural inclinations together with the mental health movement, and I know we can make common cause. And the only thing I really want to say is that it's easy for us to get subsumed by larger systems And we've always had to work against that. And there are larger social justice issues or different social justice issues that we need to keep an eye out for too. You know, we're not part of another social justice movement. We're the recovery movement. So what we have learned is that, you know, that like we draw lessons from like the HIV/AIDS advocacy movement. They were brilliant. They're ongoingly brilliant. So we can learn from them and on and on and on. So you know, I guess what I'm saying is I want to remain true to what we do. That's all I want to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Joe.
All right. So, yeah, I agree with what everybody is saying, except for the action part. I think that the future is the action, and that there is going to need some training. When you talk about civil rights or social justice, you know what I mean, especially the history of this, right? Where's that? Who's teaching that, right? As far as how does that connect to peer support and who we are today? I think I love that, yeah, that really my history starts with the mental health side because of my family, you know, having a brother with schizophrenia, all of these diagnoses, every brother 7, you know what I mean, all because of the trauma, you know, alcoholism and the way we medicate all of this trauma, you know, with all of these isms, right? And all of the mental health challenges that we have because of the trauma. And so, but how is that taught and then really for peers to really get it, right? So they can really provide multiple paths of recovery. I think that they would even be more comfortable if they knew, again, what is culture? What is the culture of your organization, right? Every organization has its own culture. You know, Bill White and us, we talked about that years ago. So, so the thing is for us to really get, you know what I mean, what does that mean? You know, mindfreedom.org was my first peer group that I really, this was years before, and then it was in the early 90s before, you know, our recovery community organization, the SAMHSA. But mindfreedom.org, you know what I mean, was because of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, you know, used the term, because he presented at the, APA, and he presented on, the thing was maladjusted. They said, maladjusted was you're going to be diagnosed with it. And he said, look, call me maladjusted for standing up for justice. Call me, he said, I call on all Americans to be maladjusted when it comes to justice, right? And then mindfreedom.org, of course, you know what I mean? They took that and that was like, they took off with that, right? And they said, yes, that's what we want. You know what I mean? That's the freedom that we want. You know what I mean? Don't be making us take no, you know what I mean, medications, etc. You know, and I love it because me and Jesse here, Jesse Davis, we presented in New York, you know, just earlier this year. And I got a chance to see Maladjusted peer group again, you know, the organization. So that was cool hanging out with them. But all I'm saying is that bringing that to the forefront and learning again about the culture, learning about what does that mean, our history, and how does that really relate to us going forward, as far as our culture of our organization, as far as the culture of our peer group, what trainings are we putting in place? The action it's got to be something different. I'm in the Black community, so again, and that is so cool to be in the Black community for really to spread recovery and to do a big Texas rally in the Black community, and I want to see the ripple effect, you know. But I've got to all coaches. I mean, again, that's, you know, we just have to get there with the training. So I just wanted to say that.
No, it's like, what do we have in common? Well, some of the things that we've all experienced have come about in different ways. Many of us universally have experienced a lot of traumatization for a variety of reasons. And for some of us, it has manifested in what gets called mental illness. For others, it gets manifested in what's called substance use. For others, it manifests in being houseless, being incarcerated, right? It shows up in so many different ways. And how do we bring ourselves together and find those commonalities to support, as many of you said, all different pathways? I do want to say, Amy, you put in the chat that it's really important to you to bring that peer services in the state hospital in Texas came out of seclusion and restraint reduction initiative. So it really was an anti-oppressive movement to push at what was currently happening and being a huge part of looking at ways to honor people's rights, even in a place where at times people have limited choice, using the peer role in the workforce and the system to continue to push into the system to uphold people's rights, bring the value of lived experience in the forefront. And it also created a place where people were then able to get the beauty of peer support and all other beautiful things that peer support can and does bring into. And then Noah, you were talking about that in your group as well, the work that permeated the system at ASH. They had peer specialists hiring committees and adopted a recovery question in all interviews. I also see Nydia's hand up, so I want to make sure that we get to you. No? Okay, let me see. Is anybody else?
I have one thing. I think just in general, like this event, kind of the grand umbrella event going like to last week, you know, the way the history was set up, the conversations today, I just happened to have, I was lucky to be able to go up to Dallas to see APA and Joe Powell celebrate their 25-year anniversary, and kind of it was like a golden thread with what you all have been doing here. You know, he had, you know, the people that started APA as an idea in a conversation got to, you know, really it was like a night of celebrating history and like really making a difference in our communities. And it's just kind of brought up a thing like how I'm hearing more and more. It's like we've had this 4-year gap because of COVID around gathering together. And in that time, we're having new leaders emerge, a lot of new work going on, and it's not connected. I think a lot of people aren't aware of like the shoulders that they stand upon, the giants that have done so many things in our field. And it's just, I think it's really reiterating the importance for, you know, the state to look at ways to bring us all together, and that, you know, understanding and being connected to this history is just vital. And like Jason's saying, if we don't get it recorded, we're going to lose it. And I think people don't really have that connection at the moment. And I think it's an opportunity for us to do something. But this is really, I think it's had profound effect on me, and jarring my memory, you know, of how important all this stuff is.
Yeah, I think that was probably the biggest thing too. My takeaway was like everything that happened, and kind of, I think what I shared in some of the groups is like the lens at which you look through history, right? Based on one, your own cultural lens, but also based on what you did during that time and point in time in the history and the timeline, right? And so I think, you know, Noah had the pleasure of being at the APA event. I had the pleasure of being at the Texas Black Caucus event last night. And they did the same theme. It was like, how do we look at the history? And their whole theme was like the symbol Sankofa, of like looking at the history and honoring the history, while like the symbol itself is a bird looking back, but like, well, in some pictures you'll see the wings flapping, in some pictures you'll just see the wings there, but while kind of flying forward, but you're looking back to honor history, but you're moving forward. And so how can we do that in a lovely way, in a nice way, of how do we honor the history in the movement of peer support, with knowing, like Joe was saying, that there's action behind the movement, right? So we can be grateful for the past, and there's pieces missing from the history that we're talking about, because there's so many people that are out there, and definitely finding multiple ways to capture that. Because like Jason also mentioned, one person can't capture all the history, because again, there are so many people in the movement that we don't even know. Like we got a whole bunch of nameless people whose voice that we want to amplify, but they were still there and they were still present, that we don't know about. But also really thinking about, okay, how can we also pass the torch to the younger generation? Because there's a whole movement happening that sometimes we're not a part of, because we're dealing with the everyday mundane stuff of what we deal with every day. And then also, you know, honoring the fact that our lived experiences are different. And again, going back to that one band, one sound movement, but really focusing on like, you know what, this is great. Like we're here, and, you know, we're going to continue to live on, but then also challenging everybody to find their place in the movement. because some people will love to do the advocacy work. That's not everybody's strength, and that's okay. You don't have to, that doesn't have to be your strength. I think I heard about it best last night in the speech was like, we need a outside movement, so a tree shaker, and then we need a jam maker. Some of us are going to be tree shakers. We're going to be outside in the community, making sure things get, shaken up and talking about stuff. Some of us are going to be the jam makers, where you're going to go to the legislative process, you're going to advocate, or you're going to be legislators. Also, you need an inside game and an outside game. You got to work the offense and the defense at the same time. Some of us, again, I want to be a linebacker, running back. My body is not built for running back, not big stocky, right? Like, I can run, just throw me the ball, coach, put me in the game. But I think just understanding what our place is, and then understanding the legacy that we want to leave. So regardless of whether you know my name or not, I need you to know the legacy that has happened and the work that we put in. But we can't talk about legacy if people aren't doing the work. And so I think that's a piece of it too. A lot of folks that historically you've done the work, but we got to continue that mindset of working in this space. And how do we do that? Whether the work is volunteering, whether the work is just talking to community, wherever that work is, how do we value those spaces? And then again, passing the torches to the next generation, because they're going to carry this torch long before Felicia is gone. And we want peer support to keep moving. And so what can we do to help support that in this movement? Because again, the movement is not going to stop unless we stop it. And our goal is that we don't want to do that. And then reminding people that you find your place in the movement. It does not have to look like everybody else's place, but you find where you fit in. Get in where you fit in is what the saying used to say. Get in where you fit in. And
That's
fit
right.
in place. But let us know how we can help support in that piece of it, because I think that's the value, is that everybody has a space in this movement. You just have to find the space that resonates with you.
Well said. That's a great ending point. I do want to bring everybody's attention to the chat. And just for folks that want to hear it, want to hear what's going on. The last comment was about forensic commitments, and they're taken over in state hospitals, and the criminalization of mental health and human behavior without the recognition of the impact of trauma, and that there need to be safe spaces in these places like the Oasis that Amy brought into is it Terrell or Terrell? Terrell?
It was Terrell.
Terrell, thank you. Into Terrell. All right. Thank you all so much for that summary and for sharing some of the insights and the wisdom that you had with one another and things that need to be continued. I do want to.
Can I just highlight one other thing in the chat?
Sure.
Amy put a picture of the wall, the recovery wall, and part of what she created was celebrating when people left the hospital. Amy, do you want to speak about, I don't want to speak for you, but it was amazing because it was designed to show hope, and the impact of that alone, that one recognition, was huge for a lot of people. And these are some of the things that I think we need to remember so we don't lose them.
Yeah, it was just one of those things, because everything I did at that time was what might have been helpful to me. And I had some black paint at my house, and they basically said we could create this oasis, but we didn't have any budget or anything. So I found stuff. And so it was really a wall where when people were discharged, if they wanted to, they put their handprint on there, and we'd put the date and their name. And it didn't matter how many times they were in and out if they wanted to, because each part of that's part of their journey. Right. And it served as the point of, just like Anna said, as a reminder that people, one, do leave for persons who may be going through that, but also for other people, that the staff as well, is that like people move forward, people get better. This is a journey. Like this is the place where we have the ability to support people in their healing. And I have my hand on there, my couple of 1,000 dates on there. I had a few dates there, but I even put it when I was leaving and they were doing a thing, and I put my final leaving date at that point in time, which is when I was saying I was finally discharged, which was when I left to go work in the community. But it really was just that celebrating and talking through, and we as peer specialists would just have a conversation with the individual and just talk to them and share with them, and then like listen to them, but mostly just like really celebrate that step, because it was a big step.
Wow, and what a beautiful representation. As you said, oftentimes providers don't have exposure to us in recovery, right? So they're at a bit of a disadvantage because they see us when we are maybe struggling the most
Exactly it.
or our most unwell moments. But as we move on and work in the community and get involved in policy and administration and start organizations and have a career, oftentimes we don't go back to say, this is where I'm at, this is what my life is at. So what a beautiful representation of the truth, which is we actually recover. That's a great final note. So in saying that, Julie, I'm gonna send it to you for any last minute admin that you want to share with the group.